Miami to California, October 26th, 2024, when security guard Ethan Vasquez found himself standing in the USS Hornet's medical bay at 3:17 a.m., holding a clipboard he didn't remember picking up. The worst part wasn't the impossible cold or the smell of seawater in a sealed room. It was realizing someone had been using his body while he slept. Welcome to the War Maestro's archive, where tonight we learn that the dead have been filing paperwork through the living. Ethan's hands shook as he read his own handwriting, describing wounds he'd never seen. Aviation machinist, mate second class, Roberto Vasquez, multiple lacerations from bomb fragment penetration, frame 100, 15 starboard, expired 09:47 hours. His grandfather's name, written in his own script, detailing injuries that matched exactly with classified Navy damage reports from the Battle of Santa Cruz, reports that had never been released to families. The USS Hornet Museum operated with a skeleton crew during overnight hours, just 3 people responsible for securing a floating city that had housed over 3,000 souls during wartime. But as Ethan stumbled through the narrow corridors toward the archives, he realized they weren't alone. Every shadow seemed to move independently, and the ship's intercom system kept crackling with fragments of radio transmissions from October 26, 1942. Dr. Nora Blackwell should have been exhausted after 16 straight hours in the archives, but her body moved as she cross-referenced casualty lists between CV-8 and CV-12. Her research had uncovered something the Navy had buried. During CV-12's commissioning ceremony in 1943, personal effects and remains recovered from CV-8's wreckage had been secretly sealed within the new ship's hull. The dead had literally been built into CV-12's structure, their presence hidden in compartments that were later welded shut and marked as structural voids. 3 decks above, Maintenance Supervisor Ray Kello found himself standing in the sealed compartment where his father had died in 1967, though he had no memory of entering the space or cutting through the welded door. The compartment reeked of seawater and decay, despite being above the waterline. Worse, he could hear breathing that wasn't his own, coming from walls that contained more than just steel and insulation. The museum's daytime ghost tours were carefully orchestrated entertainment, but what happened during overnight hours followed a different script entirely. Every October 26th, staff members would be found unconscious in impossible locations, clutching handwritten documents that contained classified information about CV-8 casualties. The museum's management had learned to schedule minimal overnight coverage on this date, and to destroy any documentation found the following morning. Ethan's radio crackled to life with a voice that sounded like his own, but older. Security to all stations. Muster in the wardroom for casualty report verification. He hadn't transmitted anything, but his voice continued broadcasting throughout the ship. All personnel report to assigned stations for final formation. The temperature throughout the ship began dropping rapidly, and condensation started forming on bulkheads in patterns that resembled human silhouettes. In the archives, Dr. Blackwell watched frost spread across her research documents, the ice forming words that spelled out names from her casualty lists. Ray felt his breath turn to vapor as he realized the compartment around him was filling with the ghostly outlines of men in Navy dress. Whites, all standing at attention, all waiting for something. Ethan's hand moved independently, continuing to write casualty reports as his rational mind screamed warnings. Security guard Ethan Vasquez, assigned to Damage Control Unit 7, USS Hornet CV-8. Permanent duty station, effective immediately. His own name, his own handwriting, documenting his recruitment into a crew that had been dead for 8 decades. The ship's intercom system filled with the sound of a bosun's whistle, followed by an announcement in a voice that belonged to no living person. Now hear this. All hands to quarters for final muster. Ghost Division. Report for eternal duty assignment. Ethan dropped the pencil and ran. Ethan's sprint through the ship's corridors ended abruptly when he realized his feet were carrying him toward the archives, not away from the medical bay. His legs moved despite his terror, and the clipboard remained clutched in his hand despite his attempts to drop it. Dr. Nora Blackwell looked up from her research without surprise. Her desk was covered with documents that organized themselves while she watched, several bearing Ethan's handwriting despite being dated from decades before his birth. "You've been writing reports for months," she said matter-of-factly. "Every night shift, you file casualty documentation. Management collects them each morning." The temperature dropped to 20 degrees in seconds. Ethan's breath became visible as frost spread across the documents, forming names in the ice: Roberto Vasquez, James Mitchell, Thomas Wheeler. When they built CV-12, they incorporated materials from CV-8's wreckage, Nora explained, her voice oddly formal. "Steel, equipment, personal items. They built a tomb inside a warship." The archive lights flickered as shadows moved along the bulkheads, uniformed figures standing at attention in positions that corresponded to duty stations from CV-8's original blueprints. "They're not haunting us," Nora said, her academic composure cracking. "They're processing us." Ray Kella sat at the wardroom table in perfect military posture, his maintenance coveralls somehow transformed into a crisp Navy uniform that shouldn't have existed. His eyes stared straight ahead with the glassy focus of a man following orders he couldn't consciously hear. When Ethan and Nora entered, Ray's head turned to acknowledge their arrival. "Take your seats," Ray said in a voice that carried decades of military authority he'd never possessed. "The briefing will commence when all personnel are present and accounted for." The wardroom had changed. Maps of the Solomon Islands covered walls that had displayed museum information an hour earlier. Battle charts from October 1942 replaced modern safety notices, and the smell of diesel fuel and cordite filled the air, despite the ship's engines being cold for 30 years. Most disturbing were the chairs, 13 seats arranged around the table, with 11 already occupied by figures in navy dress whites, whose faces remained obscured in shadow. Ethan forced himself into a chair, fighting against muscles that wanted to stand at attention. The moment he sat down, knowledge flooded his consciousness like water rushing through a breach in a ship's hull. He knew these men's names, their ranks, their final moments. Aboard CV-8, aviation machinist mate Roberto Vasquez sat directly across from him, his grandfather's face finally visible but bearing wounds that had never healed. "Damage control report," announced a figure at the head of the table wearing commander's stripes. His voice echoed with the authority of the grave. "USS Hornet CV-8 sustained critical damage at frames 110 through 120, resulting in progressive flooding and loss of power. Evacuation of personnel to secondary vessel CV-12 initiated but never completed." Nora found herself taking notes in handwriting that wasn't quite her own, documenting details about the battle that existed in no historical record. Her pen moved independently, recording conversations between dying sailors and their final requests. The documents she wrote contained information that should have died with the men 8 decades ago. "Mission objectives remain incomplete," the commander continued. "Personal correspondence undelivered. Casualty notifications unfiled. Family notifications never processed. Secondary crew aboard CV-12 has been assigned to complete outstanding administrative duties." Ray's mouth moved, but the words came from somewhere else. "Sir, CV-12. Maintenance logs indicate structural anomalies in sealed compartments. Personal effects storage shows signs of organized activity. Request permission to investigate compliance with standing orders." "Permission granted," the commander replied. "All personnel will maintain current assignments until mission completion. Dr. Blackwell will continue documentation review. Security Specialist Vasquez will complete casualty processing. Maintenance Supervisor Kello will prepare compartments for final inventory." Ethan watched in horror as his hand rose in a perfect military salute he'd never been taught. His mouth opened without his permission. "Sir." requesting clarification on duration of assignment. The shadows around the table leaned forward in unison. Assignment duration: permanent. Relief of duty: upon completion of all outstanding tasks dating to October 26, 1942. Estimated completion time: indefinite. The briefing room began to shift around them, walls dissolving to reveal the interior of CV-8 during its final battle. Water poured through gaping holes in the hull, while sailors worked frantically at their stations, maintaining discipline even as their ship died beneath them. Ethan could see his grandfather at his post, bleeding from shrapnel wounds but still trying to complete a damage report that would never be filed. "You see now why we cannot rest." Roberto Vasquez spoke directly to his grandson for the first time. "We died with duties incomplete. The Navy transferred our remains to this ship, but never transferred our responsibilities. For 82 years, we have waited for someone to help us finish what we started." Nora's academic mind reeled with the implications. The museum wasn't just displaying history, it was continuing an active military operation that had been suspended at the moment of CV-8's sinking. The dead crew had been waiting 8 decades for living personnel to complete their final administrative tasks. "What happens if we refuse?" she asked, though her voice carried less conviction than she'd intended. The commander's shadow smiled, revealing teeth that gleamed like polished steel. "Refusal is not consistent with good order and discipline. Personnel who attempt to abandon their posts will be processed for court-martial and permanent assignment to restricted duty." The briefing room snapped back to its museum appearance, but the 11 figures remained seated around the table. They weren't ghosts. They were active duty personnel, waiting for their relief shift to complete the handover. And that relief shift was sitting right there with them, already taking orders, already becoming part of the crew that would never be discharged. "Briefing concluded," the commander announced. "Personnel will report to assigned stations and begin immediate execution of standing orders. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action." Ethan, Nora, and Ray stood in perfect unison, their movements synchronized like a drill team. As they filed out of the wardroom, each carried assignments that would keep them busy for the rest of their lives, or longer. Ray found personal belongings from 1942, arranged in the sealed compartment, as if their owners had just stepped away. The items moved on their own. Letters rewrote themselves. Photographs aged in real time, showing decades of life their owners never lived. 3 decks below, Ethan operated radio equipment that hummed with impossible power. His hands adjusted frequencies with knowledge he'd never possessed, his grandfather's voice merging with his own as they transmitted to families decades dead. Nora discovered her research had been reorganized into a comprehensive database serving the dead crew's needs. Personnel files bore her name, Ray's name, Ethan's name, detailed profiles showing they'd been evaluated and chosen for specific qualifications. The files revealed the systematic nature of the operation. Museum employees were assessed, conditioned, then integrated into the spiritual chain of command. Ray's maintenance logs showed modifications he couldn't remember making, converting spaces for permanent human habitation. They weren't being haunted, they were being recruited into a crew that maintained operations beyond death, and their preparations for permanent assignment were already complete. The ship's klaxon blared through every corridor at exactly 0947 hours, the precise moment CV-8 had taken its fatal hit 82 years earlier. But this wasn't a memorial tribute. It was reveille, calling all hands to battle stations for a mission that had never officially ended. Ethan, Nora, and Ray found their legs carrying them toward the hangar deck, their minds screaming protests, while their bodies followed orders they'd never received. The hangar deck had transformed into something that shouldn't have been possible. Where vintage museum aircraft had been displayed hours earlier, ghostly, dauntless dive bombers and Wildcat fighters now sat in perfect formation, their engines turning over with ethereal blue flames. Spiritual aircrew in flight gear moved through pre-flight checks on planes that existed only in memory, preparing for sorties that would never launch. Commander Harrison Webb materialized at the center of the deck, his uniform bearing the stains of seawater and aviation fuel from the day he died. His voice carried across the hangar with the authority of a man who had never been relieved of command. Final muster for USS Hornet CV-8. All hands prepare for casualty transfer to permanent duty stations aboard CV-12. Ethan watched in horror as dozens of ghostly sailors formed ranks around the 3 living crew members. Each spirit bore the wounds that had killed them. Bomb fragments, burns from aviation fuel fires, crushing injuries from collapsed bulkheads. They stood at attention, waiting for the completion of administrative procedures that had been interrupted by their deaths. Personnel files indicate 3 candidates suitable for permanent assignment, Commander Webb announced, consulting a clipboard that materialized in his hands. Security Specialist Vasquez, approved for communications duty based on family connection to CV-8 casualties. Dr. Blackwell, approved for documentation services based on historical research qualifications. Maintenance Supervisor Kello, approved for facilities management based on technical expertise. Ray tried to speak, but his voice emerged with military formality he'd never possessed. Sir, requesting clarification on transfer orders. Transfer orders are permanent, Webb replied. Living personnel assigned to CV-8 will maintain current duties until biological functions cease, at which point they will transition to spiritual crew status. Estimated duration of living service, 40 to 50 years, based on current ages and health assessments. The revelation struck them like a physical blow. They weren't being recruited for a single night of supernatural duty. The dead crew intended to keep them aboard for the remainder of their natural lives, using them as living intermediaries to complete 8 decades of unfinished business. When they eventually died, they would join the spiritual crew as permanent members, trapped aboard the ship for eternity. Nora found her voice, though it trembled with barely controlled terror. What about our families, our lives outside this ship? Commander Webb's expression showed genuine confusion, as if the concept of existing apart from naval service was incomprehensible. Personnel do not maintain civilian obligations during active duty. Family notifications will be processed through appropriate channels. Your previous employment has been terminated, and your personal effects will be transferred to ship's storage. The hangar deck filled with the sounds of a carrier preparing for combat operations. Engines roared as ghostly aircraft taxied into launch positions. Ordnance crews loaded phantom bombs and ammunition, while flight deck personnel guided planes that cast no shadows. The dead were conducting full-flight operations with equipment that existed only in spiritual form, maintaining the routines that had defined their lives until the moment they died. But here's what the Navy never documented, Commander Webb continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the entire deck. CV-8 didn't just sink at Santa Cruz. We were abandoned, left to die while Enterprise escaped with minimal damage. Our sacrifice bought time for the fleet to regroup, but no one ever acknowledged that our deaths served a strategic purpose. The ghostly crew's resentment wasn't directed at the living. It was focused on an institution that had classified their final battle as a tactical defeat rather than recognizing their sacrifice. They had maintained military discipline for 8 decades while waiting for someone to complete their official recognition, their casualty notifications, and their recommendations for posthumous honors. CV-12 inherited our name but not our legacy, Webb explained. The Navy wanted the fighting spirit of the Hornet name without acknowledging the cost we paid to earn it. They built the new ship with our remains but never filed the proper transfer orders. We've been waiting 82 years for someone to complete the administrative work necessary to officially transfer our service records to CV-12. Ethan realized with sick clarity that the supernatural activity wasn't random haunting. It was bureaucratic procedure. The dead crew had been following Navy regulations by attempting to complete their service records through proper administrative channels. They had tried to process their own deaths according to military protocol, but the living Navy had never provided the necessary clerical support. Your assignment is to complete 8 decades of backlogged administrative work, Webb announced. Casualty reports, family notifications, service record transfers, and posthumous award recommendations. The estimated completion time is 20 to 30 years of full-time clerical work, assuming standard Navy processing delays. Ray's maintenance knowledge provided the most terrifying insight. The ship had been systematically modified over decades to support permanent human habitation. Previous museum employees had unconsciously installed life support systems, communication equipment, and living quarters that would allow the 3 newest crew members to remain aboard indefinitely while they processed paperwork for the dead. The ghostly aircraft began launching from the hangar deck, passing through solid bulkheads as they departed on missions that would never reach their targets. Each launch represented another sailor's unfinished duty, another task that required living personnel to complete the administrative follow-up. Muster concluded, Commander Webb announced. Living personnel report to assigned workstations. Failure to maintain acceptable performance standards will result in immediate transition to spiritual crew status. As the hangar deck returned to its museum appearance, Ethan, Nora, and Ray understood that their transformation from visitors to permanent crew was complete. They were now active duty Navy personnel aboard a ship that had been sunk 82 years ago, assigned to complete clerical work that would keep them busy until they died at their desks. The dead had found the perfect solution to their personnel shortage. Draft the living and work them until they joined the spiritual crew permanently. 6 hours of processing casualty reports had driven Nora to the edge of madness. Her handwriting had become indistinguishable from that of a 1940s Navy clerk as she documented injuries in clinical detail that made her physically sick. Compound fractures from bomb fragments, third-degree burns covering 60% of body surface, drowning while trapped in flooded compartments. Each report required her to experience the sailor's final moments through vivid mental imagery that felt more real than her own memories. The worst part wasn't the graphic descriptions. It was the personal details that followed each death. She found herself writing letters of condolence to mothers who had died decades earlier, explaining how their sons' final thoughts had been of home. Her pen moved independently, composing intimate messages from dead sailors to families who could never receive them, creating an endless cycle of grief that spanned generations. Ethan's communications duty had evolved into something far more sinister than radio operations. The ship's intercom system had become a direct line to the afterlife, and he was required to facilitate conversations between the living and the dead. Family members who had never known exactly how their relatives died were contacted through dreams, with Ethan serving as the supernatural operator, connecting calls across the boundary between life and death. But the dead sailors weren't content with simple family notifications. They wanted to participate in decades of missed family events, offering advice on marriages, career decisions, and child rearing to descendants who had no idea they were receiving guidance from beyond the grave. Ethan found himself transcribing conversations between ghostly grandfathers and living grandchildren, creating a supernatural customer service department for unresolved family business. Ray's maintenance duties had expanded beyond simple facility management into something that violated the laws of physics. He was required to maintain equipment that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, keeping 1940s radio gear operational while servicing modern museum systems that the dead crew had learned to manipulate for their administrative needs. His tools worked on machinery that flickered between spiritual and physical existence, requiring him to repair damage that occurred during battles fought 80 years ago. The most disturbing aspect of his assignment was the installation work. Under spiritual supervision, Ray had been unconsciously modifying the ship's structure to accommodate the growing supernatural bureaucracy. Additional filing cabinets appeared in sealed compartments. Communication equipment materialized in spaces that had been empty for decades. The dead crew was expanding their administrative capability using his expertise, preparing for permanent operations that would continue indefinitely. The three living crew members quickly discovered that their supernatural supervisors maintained the same bureaucratic inefficiencies that plagued any large military organization. Reports required multiple revisions for minor formatting errors. Communication protocols demanded proper military courtesy, even when dealing with family members who had been dead for 50 years. Requests for clarification on duty assignments resulted in referrals to spiritual officers who were unavailable due to their own unfinished business. Worse, the dead crew operated on Navy time, which meant that urgent tasks could be delayed for days while proper channels were consulted. A simple casualty notification might require approval from 3 different ghostly departments, each staffed by spirits who had been waiting decades for someone to process their own paperwork. The supernatural chain of command was as frustratingly slow as any military bureaucracy, except that the consequences for delays involved eternal damnation rather than simple reprimands. Ethan attempted to expedite a family notification by skipping proper procedures, only to find himself facing a disciplinary hearing conducted by ghostly officers who had been court-martialed during World War II. The dead took military protocol seriously, and shortcuts that might save time in the living world were considered insubordination in the spiritual realm. His punishment involved additional communication duties with increasingly difficult family situations. Nora discovered that historical accuracy was paramount to the supernatural filing system. Any casualty report that contained minor factual errors had to be completely rewritten, with the corrections verified through consultation with spirits who had witnessed the events firsthand. Her academic training became a liability rather than an asset, as the ghosts demanded documentation that met standards of evidence that exceeded any scholarly publication. Ray found that equipment failures in the spiritual realm required him to troubleshoot problems that had occurred in the past, while maintaining systems that operated in the present. A radio malfunction from 1942 needed to be repaired using 1940s procedures, but the same device had to remain compatible with modern museum operations. He was essentially maintaining 2 versions of the same equipment across different time periods, using tools that existed in both eras simultaneously. The psychological toll became apparent as the 3 living crew members began exhibiting behavior patterns typical of their ghostly colleagues. They stood at attention when addressing spiritual officers. They followed Navy regulations that hadn't been in effect for decades. They spoke using military terminology and protocol that had been drilled into them through hours of supernatural indoctrination. Most terrifying was their growing acceptance of the situation. The constant exposure to military discipline and the supernatural bureaucracy was normalizing their circumstances. They began thinking of their families as civilians who wouldn't understand military necessity. Their concerns about the outside world diminished as they became more invested in completing their assigned duties efficiently. The dead crew's patient professionalism was more effective than any torture at breaking down resistance to permanent assignment. They weren't cruel or vindictive. They were simply dedicated to maintaining proper military standards while completing decades of overdue administrative work. The living were being converted through exposure to competent supervision and meaningful work, even though that work involved processing paperwork for people who had been dead for 80 years. By dawn, Ethan, Nora, and Ray had processed more military documentation in one night than some Navy clerks handled in an entire enlistment. Their efficiency impressed their ghostly supervisors, who began discussing permanent promotions and expanded responsibilities within the spiritual chain of command. The morning shift supervisor found them at their desks at 0800 hours, still in uniform but sitting with military posture that seemed different. When she greeted them, they responded in perfect unison. "Good morning, ma'am." All personnel present and accounted for. She noticed changes, new insignia on their uniforms, an efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. Their knowledge of naval history impressed visitors, though she couldn't quite remember when they'd become such experts. The museum operated smoothly around them. Ethan handled communication. Nora's research accessed sources that amazed her academic peers. Ray maintained equipment with skills that exceeded his training. They were model employees who never seemed to tire, never called in sick, never spoke about their lives outside the ship. Sometimes, late at night, security cameras captured them at their desks, working diligently on paperwork that wasn't there during the day. When questioned, they would smile politely and explain they were catching up on administrative tasks. Their dedication was admirable, if a bit intense. Years passed. The three became legends in naval history circles, their expertise unmatched. Visitors often commented on the staff's exceptional knowledge and professional demeanor. The museum thrived under their care. During their 10th anniversary celebration, a colleague asked Ethan about his life before the Hornet. He paused, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Before the Hornet," he repeated slowly. I've always been here, haven't I?" Nora and Ray exchanged glances, the same uncertainty in their eyes. The question hung in the air, unanswered, and somehow unanswerable. The USS Hornet Museum continues to operate with exceptional efficiency, staffed by dedicated employees who provide historical information with first-hand accuracy. They are consummate professionals who will never retire, never transfer, never leave. And every October 26th, they stand at memorial services for their fellow crew members, though none of them can quite remember when they first put on the uniform or why they feel such profound connection to sailors who died decades before they were born. The War Maestro's files remain classified, but those who know where to look can still see the three employees at their posts, serving with distinction aboard a vessel that has been conducting active operations for over 80 years without interruption. If this tale from the War Maestro archive left you questioning your own memories, take a moment to check your employment records. Make sure you remember how you got your current job, and subscribe to uncover more dark military histories that blur the line between duty and damnation. Hit that notification bell. You'll want to know when our next classified file surfaces from the depths. Share this story with those who understand that the most terrifying assignments are the ones you never remember accepting. And next time you visit a military museum, pay close attention to the staff. Notice how they stand, how they speak, how much they really know about events they supposedly only studied in books. Ask them about their lives before the museum, and watch their faces carefully when they try to answer. Remember, some personnel files are updated automatically, and some duty rosters span multiple lifetimes.